During a family cruise, my son-in-law pushed me into the sea and shouted, "Time to learn how to swim with sharks." After they rescued me, I only said 3 words. When we returned, I rushed to the bank, canceled the credit cards, sold the house, and vanished. When they called begging for money, "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached." I never thought a family vacation could become a death sentence. At 65, I'd survived building a construction company from nothing, raised a daughter as a single father, and weathered every storm life threw at me. But nothing prepared me for the moment my own son-in-law tried to murder me in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The cruise was Sarah's idea. "Dad, you've been working too hard," she said over dinner 3 weeks earlier, her voice sweet as honey. "Glenn found this amazing deal on a 7-day Caribbean cruise. It'll be perfect. Just the 3 of us, quality family time." Glenn nodded enthusiastically, flashing that practiced smile that had charmed my daughter into marrying him 5 years ago. Back then, I thought he was good for her. I was wrong about a lot of things. The ship was magnificent, I'll give him that. 15 decks of luxury, restaurants I couldn't pronounce the names of, and a price tag that made my wallet wince. Glenn insisted on upgrading us to the premium package. Spa treatments, specialty dining, the works. "It's on me, Gerald," he said, clapping my shoulder. "You deserve the best." At the time, I thought it was generous. Now I know it was guilt money. The first 2 days were perfect, too perfect. Sarah seemed genuinely happy, laughing at Glenn's jokes, linking arms with me as we walked the deck. Glenn was attentive, asking about my business, my plans for retirement. "You know, Gerald, you should really think about slowing down. Enjoy life a little. You've earned it." The way he said it sent a chill down my spine, but I brushed it off. Maybe I was just getting paranoid in my old age. It was day 3 when everything changed. We were on the upper deck after dinner, the ocean stretching endlessly in every direction. The ship's lights cast dancing shadows on the water, and most passengers had retreated to the lounges or their cabins. Glenn suggested we get some fresh air, away from the crowds. "The stars are incredible out here," he said. Sarah stayed behind, claiming she needed to call her friend Lisa back home. Strange, since she'd never mentioned Lisa before. Glenn and I walked to the railing, the wind whipping through what was left of my gray hair. The water below looked black, infinite, hungry. "You know, Gerald," Glenn said, his voice different now, colder. "Sarah and I have been talking about the future." I turned to look at him, and something in his expression made my blood freeze. His eyes weren't kind anymore. They were calculating. "What about the future?" I asked, gripping the railing tighter. Glenn stepped closer. "About what happens when you're not around anymore. About the business, the house, all those investments you've been so secretive about." His voice dropped to a whisper. "About how much easier things would be if certain obstacles weren't in the way." Before I could process what he meant, Glenn's hands were on my back, hard, violent. The push sent me tumbling over the railing, and as I fell toward the black water, I heard him shout at the top of his lungs, "Help! Man overboard! Gerald fell! Someone help him!" But there was something else, something he thought no one would hear over the wind and waves. "Time to learn to swim with the sharks, old man." The water hit me like a concrete wall. Ice cold, it knocked the breath from my lungs and sent shockwaves through my 65-year-old body. I went under immediately, the salt water burning my throat as I fought to surface. My clothes became anchors, dragging me down, and for a terrifying moment I thought this was it. This was how Gerald Morrison would die, murdered by his own son-in-law while his daughter watched from above. When I finally broke the surface, gasping and choking, I could hear the commotion on the ship. Alarms were sounding, crew members were shouting, and somewhere in the chaos I could hear Sarah screaming my name. But as I struggled to stay afloat, treading water in the middle of the ocean, one thought cut through my panic like a knife. Glenn hadn't fallen over the railing trying to save me. He wasn't in the water with me. He was still on the ship, playing the part of the concerned son-in-law. The rescue took 27 minutes. 27 minutes of fighting waves, of water filling my lungs, of wondering if I'd ever see dry land again. When they finally pulled me from the ocean, hypothermic and barely conscious, the first face I saw was Glenn's. He was crying, holding Sarah as she sobbed into his chest. "Thank God you're alive, Gerald," he said, his voice breaking with what sounded like relief. "I thought we'd lost you." But I saw something else in his eyes. Disappointment. This wasn't supposed to be a rescue. This was supposed to be a funeral. As the ship's doctor checked my vitals and wrapped me in heated blankets, I replayed every moment of the fall, Glenn's hands on my back, the deliberate push, the way he'd shouted about sharks, not help, and most telling of all, how quickly he'd appeared at the rescue scene, perfectly dry, perfectly composed. They moved me to the ship's medical bay, where Sarah hovered over me like a devoted daughter. "Dad, I was so scared," she whispered, holding my hand. When Glenn ran to get help, I thought my heart would stop. Glenn nodded solemnly, playing his role perfectly. It happened so fast, Gerald. 1 second you were admiring the view, the next you were gone. The railing must have been wet, slippery. I stared at him, this man who'd just tried to kill me, and felt something die inside my chest. Not my body. The doctor said I'd make a full recovery. But something deeper. Trust. Hope. The belief that family meant something sacred. Glenn leaned closer, probably thinking I couldn't speak, couldn't think clearly after my ordeal. His face was inches from mine, and I could smell his cologne, the same expensive brand he'd been wearing since he married my daughter. That's when I summoned what little strength I had left and whispered 3 words that made his face go white as the ship's hull. He jerked back like I'd slapped him, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasped on deck. Sarah was adjusting my blankets and missed the exchange entirely, but Glenn heard every word, and in that moment, he knew that his perfect plan had just become his worst nightmare. As I lay in that narrow medical bay bed listening to the ship's engines humming beneath us, I realized something that chilled me more than the Atlantic Ocean ever could. This wasn't a random moment of violence. This wasn't a crime of passion. Glenn had planned this. He'd brought me on this cruise specifically to kill me. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a terrible question began to form. Was my daughter Sarah just another victim of his manipulation? Or was she part of it too? The answer to that question would change everything I thought I knew about my family. But first I had to survive the rest of this cruise, and I had to make sure that Glenn's next attempt, because there would be a next attempt, would be his last. The rest of that night I lay awake in the medical bay listening to every creak and groan of the ship. Every footstep in the corridor outside made my heart race. Every time someone approached my door, I wondered if it was Glenn coming to finish what he'd started. The ship's doctor, a kind woman named Dr. Martinez, wanted to keep me under observation until morning. Hypothermia is serious at your age, Mr. Morrison, she explained. Your core temperature dropped dangerously low. What she didn't know was that my blood had been running cold long before I hit that water. Glenn and Sarah visited 3 times during the night. Each visit was a perfectly choreographed performance of concern and relief. Sarah would hold my hand, her eyes red from crying, while Glenn stood behind her with his hand on her shoulder playing the supportive husband. We're just so grateful you're okay, Dad, Sarah whispered during their second visit. Glenn hasn't slept at all. He keeps blaming himself for not catching you when you slipped. I watched Glenn's face when she said that, watched for any crack in his mask, any sign of guilt or fear. Instead, I saw something far more disturbing. Calculation. He was studying my reactions, measuring my responses, trying to gauge how much I remembered about our encounter at the railing. When our eyes met, he leaned forward slightly, his voice soft with fake concern. You had us so worried, Gerald. Do you remember what happened? The fall must have been traumatic. That's when I made the most important decision of the cruise. I would give him exactly what he wanted to see. A confused, grateful old man who didn't suspect a thing. It's all so fuzzy, I said, letting my voice shake slightly. I remember looking at the stars, feeling dizzy. The railing was wet, I think. Everything after that is just dark water. Glenn's shoulders relaxed almost imperceptibly. Sarah squeezed my hand tighter. Don't worry about remembering, Dad. The important thing is you're safe now. But I remembered everything. Every word Glenn had whispered about obstacles and easier futures. Every detail of his hands on my back. And most clearly, I remembered those 3 words I'd whispered to him. I know everything. The words that had drained the color from his face and turned his victory into terror. Doctor. Martinez released me the next morning with strict instructions to take it easy. No more late-night deck walks, she said with a smile, and stay hydrated. The ocean took a lot out of you. If only she knew how much the ocean had actually given me. Clarity about who I could trust and, more importantly, who I couldn't. Glenn and Sarah were waiting outside the medical bay, both dressed in matching white polo shirts like they were part of some twisted cruise advertisement. Ready to get back to our vacation, Dad? Sarah asked, linking her arm through mine. Glenn found this amazing buffet on deck 7. You need to get your strength back. Glenn nodded enthusiastically, but I caught him checking his watch. Again. He'd been doing that constantly since the rescue, like he was running on some kind of schedule. The buffet was crowded, filled with passengers loading their plates with fresh fruit and pastries. I played my part perfectly, the shaky survivor grateful to be alive. But while I nibbled on toast and sipped coffee, I watched. Glenn and Sarah sat across from me, and I began to notice things I'd missed before. The way they communicated without words. How Sarah would glance at Glenn before answering my questions. How Glenn would touch her arm whenever I mentioned feeling better or getting stronger. You know what? Glenn said suddenly, his tone too bright, too casual. Since you're feeling better, maybe we should book that excursion in St. Thomas tomorrow, the helicopter tour of the island. You'd love the views, Gerald. Sarah's fork paused halfway to her mouth, and she shot Glenn a look I couldn't quite decipher. Fear? Warning? Are you sure Dad's up for that? She asked. After yesterday, maybe something calmer would be better. Glenn's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Right, of course. Maybe the swimming with dolphins thing instead. He was pushing again, trying to get me into situations where accidents could happen. Swimming with dolphins, how convenient. How perfect for a man who'd already tried to drown me once. Actually, I said, setting down my coffee cup with deliberate care, I think I'd prefer to just relax on the ship tomorrow. Maybe spend some time in the room, catch up on sleep. I watched Glenn's face carefully as I spoke. For just a moment his mask slipped, and I saw pure frustration flash across his features. But Sarah didn't notice. She was too busy being the concerned daughter. That sounds perfect, Dad. You need rest after what you've been through. After breakfast, Sarah excused herself to call her work. Something about a project deadline she couldn't miss even on vacation. Glenn and I were alone for the first time since he'd tried to kill me. We walked slowly along the deck, passing other passengers who had no idea they were witnessing a dance between predator and prey. Beautiful morning, Glenn said, his voice carefully neutral. Hard to believe yesterday ever happened. I agreed, stopping at a railing, a different one this time with more people around. Funny how life can change in an instant. Glenn studied my face, searching for hidden meaning. You seem to be handling it well. Some people would be traumatized after an experience like that. I turned to look at him directly, and for a moment let him see something real in my eyes. Not the confused old man I'd been pretending to be, but the sharp businessman who'd built an empire from nothing. Oh, I am changed by it, Glenn. More than you might think. He blinked, uncertainty flickering across his features. Before he could respond, Sarah reappeared, slightly out of breath. Sorry that took so long. Crisis at the office. But something about her demeanor had shifted. She seemed nervous, jumpy, and when she looked at Glenn, there was something in her expression that made my stomach turn. Recognition, like they'd discussed something while she was gone. Everything okay with work? I asked. Oh, you know how it is. Same old problems. But she was lying. I'd raised this girl, changed her diapers, taught her to drive. I knew when my daughter was lying to me. The question was, what was she lying about? We spent the rest of the day doing normal cruise activities, watching a comedy show, playing shuffleboard, eating at the main dining room. But underneath the facade of family vacation fun, I felt like I was watching a play where I didn't know all the lines. Glenn and Sarah would exchange glances when they thought I wasn't looking. They'd have whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when I approached, and twice I caught Glenn on the phone, speaking in hushed tones, walking away when he saw me coming. That evening, as we dressed for dinner, I made an excuse about forgetting my reading glasses and doubled back to the room Glenn and Sarah shared. The door was slightly ajar and I could hear their voices inside. What I heard made my blood run cold. Can't keep trying the same approach, Sarah was saying, her voice tense with frustration. It's too risky now. People are watching. Glenn's response was muffled, but I caught fragments. Running out of time. And won't get another chance like this. And then Sarah said something that confirmed my worst fears. We should have planned this better. Now he's suspicious, and if he figures out what we're really doing. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding so hard I was sure they'd hear it. My own daughter. My little girl who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms. Who'd cried when I taught her to ride a bike because she was afraid of falling. She wasn't just a victim of Glenn's manipulation. She was part of the plan. As I walked back to my own cabin, one thought echoed in my mind like a death knell. They weren't done. Whatever they'd planned for this cruise, my survival had only delayed it, not stopped it. And now I had to figure out what they were really after before they found a way to finish what they'd started. The old Gerald would have confronted them, demanded answers, trusted in family bonds to fix whatever had gone wrong. But that Gerald had died in the Atlantic Ocean yesterday. The man who climbed into bed that night was someone else entirely. Someone who finally understood that sometimes the people who claim to love you the most are the ones most willing to destroy you. And I was going to make sure they learned that lesson before this cruise was over. The truth hit me like another wave of that freezing Atlantic water, but this time I was ready for it. I'd been suspecting something was wrong for months before this cruise. Little things that didn't add up, pieces of a puzzle I'd been too trusting to put together. Now, floating in the middle of my daughter's betrayal, everything finally made sense. It started 3 months ago when I found Sarah in my home office. She was sitting at my desk, my laptop open in front of her, claiming she needed to print some documents for work. My printer's broken, Dad, and I have this presentation tomorrow, she'd said, closing the laptop quickly when I walked in. At the time, I'd thought nothing of it. Now I realized she'd been going through my financial records. Then there were the phone calls. Glenn would call me at odd hours, asking casual questions about the business, about my retirement plans, about whether I'd updated my will recently. "Just thinking about the future, Gerald," he'd say. "Want to make sure Sarah's taken care of if anything happens to you." The way he said "if anything happens" should have been a warning. Instead, I'd been touched by his apparent concern for my daughter's well-being. But it was the insurance inquiry that should have been the biggest red flag. 2 weeks before the cruise, I'd received a call from my life insurance company asking to verify some information about my policy. "We show a recent request to increase your coverage amount," the representative had said. "Just confirming the details with you directly." I'd been confused. I hadn't requested any changes. When I mentioned it to Sarah later, she'd waved it off. "Probably just a clerical error, Dad. You know how these companies are." Except it wasn't an error. Someone had been trying to increase my life insurance payout, and that someone had access to my personal information. Someone who lived with me part-time, who had keys to my house, who knew where I kept my important documents. My daughter. The morning after I overheard their conversation, I made a decision that would have seemed paranoid just days earlier. I was going to investigate my own family. While Glenn and Sarah were at the breakfast buffet, I used the ship's business center to access my accounts online. What I found made me physically ill. Over the past 4 months, there had been numerous small withdrawals from my savings account. Never enough to trigger alerts, but adding up to nearly $23,000. The withdrawals were made using my debit card at ATMs near Sarah's apartment. My own daughter had been slowly draining my accounts, probably hoping I wouldn't notice until it was too late. But that wasn't the worst of it. Someone had been accessing my business email, corresponding with my clients and contractors. When I dug deeper, I found emails I'd never sent, messages that subtly suggested I was considering retirement, that I might be looking to sell Morrison Construction soon. Glenn's name appeared in several of these emails. Apparently, he'd been positioning himself as my potential successor, the son-in-law who understood the business and could take over when I was ready to step down, or when I was dead. The final piece of evidence was in my personal email, buried in the deleted folder where I never would have found it if I wasn't looking. It was a draft email from my account to a lawyer, requesting information about updating my will. The draft mentioned leaving everything to Sarah and Glenn, expressing concerns about my health and my desire to make sure my family is provided for. I'd never written that email. I'd never even thought about changing my will. Someone was systematically preparing for my death, making it look like it was my idea. I printed everything, my hands shaking as the evidence of their betrayal piled up in black and white. Then I did something that probably saved my life. I changed all my passwords, set up new security questions, and activated 2-factor authentication on every account. If they were planning to continue their theft, they'd just hit their first real roadblock. When I returned to our deck chairs, Sarah and Glenn were deep in conversation, their heads bent close together like conspirators. They broke apart when they saw me approaching, Glenn jumping up to offer me his chair. "You look tired, Gerald. Maybe you should rest." "I'm fine," I said, settling into my chair and pulling out a book I had no intention of reading. Instead, I watched them over the top of the pages, cataloging every nervous glance, every whispered word, every moment of communication I'd been too blind to see before. Around noon, Sarah announced she was going to the spa for a massage she'd booked. "I'll be gone for about 2 hours, she said, kissing my cheek. "You and Glenn can have some guy time." The kiss felt like betrayal against my skin. After she left, Glenn suggested we grab lunch at the sports bar on deck 12. "They've got the game on," he said. "Thought you might want to watch." But I noticed he chose a table in the corner, away from other patrons where our conversation wouldn't be overheard. "You know, Gerald," he said after we'd ordered, "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about things being fuzzy after your fall." He leaned forward, his voice taking on that concerned tone I now recognized as manipulation. "Memory issues can be serious at your age. Maybe you should see a doctor when we get back." I met his gaze steadily. "My memory's just fine, Glenn. Crystal clear, actually." Something flickered in his eyes. "Oh, well, that's good to hear." But his hand tightened around his beer bottle and I saw a muscle twitch in his jaw. "In fact," I continued, "I've been remembering lots of things lately, things I'd forgotten or overlooked. Funny how a near-death experience can sharpen your focus." Glenn's smile became forced, mechanical. "What kind of things?" I took a deliberate sip of my water, letting the silence stretch between us. "Oh, you know, conversations I overheard, documents I found, phone calls that didn't quite make sense at the time." I paused, watching his face go pale. The kind of things that make a man wonder who he can really trust. Glenn set down his beer with shaking hands. Gerald, I think maybe the stress of yesterday is getting to you. You're sounding a little paranoid. Am I? I asked quietly. Or am I finally seeing clearly for the first time in months? Before he could answer, my phone rang. It was Marcus Webb, my business partner for the past 15 years, calling from our office back in Tampa. I answered on speaker. Partly because I wanted Glenn to hear this conversation and partly because I wanted to test a theory. Gerald, thank God you're okay, Marcus said. I just got word about your accident. How are you feeling? Much better, thanks. Just enjoying some family time on the cruise. Good, good. Listen, I hate to bother you while you're on vacation, but we've got a situation here. That Johnson contract we've been working on? They're saying you sent an email last week agreeing to terms we never discussed. Something about bringing in a new project manager named Glenn Morrison. I don't have any record of that conversation. I watched Glenn's face as Marcus spoke. The color drained from his cheeks and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air conditioning. That's interesting, Marcus. I don't remember sending any such email. That's what I figured. The whole thing seemed off. Should I just ignore it? Yes, ignore it completely. And Marcus, when I get back, let's set up a meeting to review all our recent correspondence. I have a feeling we might find some other communications I didn't actually send. After I hung up, Glenn was staring at his hands, no longer making eye contact. Gerald, I can explain. I'm sure you can, I said calmly. I'm sure you have explanations for a lot of things. The question is how much of it would be true. Glenn's head snapped up, and for a moment, I saw the real man behind the mask, cold, calculating, desperate. You don't understand the pressure we're under. Sarah's been struggling since she lost her job and I've got debts, so you decided to kill me for my money? The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Glenn's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Around us, other passengers laughed and chatted, oblivious to the confrontation happening at our corner table. It wasn't supposed to happen like that, he whispered finally. The fall was supposed to look accidental, quick and clean. You weren't supposed to survive. There it was, the confession I'd been waiting for, delivered with the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. My son-in-law had just admitted to attempting murder, and he seemed almost relieved to finally say it out loud. And Sarah? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Glenn's silence told me everything I needed to know. I stood up slowly, my legs steadier than they'd been since I'd climbed out of that freezing ocean. Well, Glenn, I have some news for you. I did survive. And now that I know what you and my daughter are really capable of, I'm going to make sure you never get another chance to finish what you started. As I walked away from that table, leaving Glenn sitting alone with his confession and his fear, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months, control. For the first time since this nightmare began, I knew exactly what I was dealing with and I had a plan to stop it. The old Gerald would have tried to reason with them, to find some way to salvage the family relationship. But the old Gerald had died in the Atlantic Ocean 2 days ago. The man walking back to his cabin was someone else entirely, someone who understood that sometimes the people who claim to love you are the ones most willing to destroy you for their own gain. And I was going to make sure they learned that lesson in the most painful way possible. The ship docked in Miami at 7 in the morning, and by 7:30 I was in a taxi heading to the nearest branch of First National Bank. Glenn and Sarah thought I was going to collect my luggage from the storage area. I'd told them I wanted to handle it myself, that I needed some time alone to process everything that had happened during the cruise. They were more than happy to let me go, probably relieved to have a few moments to plan their next move without me watching their every gesture. What they didn't know was that I'd spent the previous night awake in my cabin, making phone calls and setting wheels in motion that would change all our lives forever. The ship's satellite internet had been expensive, but it was worth every penny to access my accounts and start the process that would end their scheme permanently. My first stop was Margaret Chen, my personal banker for the past 12 years. She was waiting for me in her office, a stack of documents already prepared on her desk. Margaret had always been efficient, but the urgency in her voice during our late-night phone call had convinced her to come in early and handle this personally. Gerald, I have to say, this is highly unusual, she said, as I settled into the chair across from her. Are you absolutely certain you want to proceed with all of these changes? I nodded, my resolve stronger than ever. Margaret, someone has been stealing from me. Someone with access to my personal information and my trust. I need to make sure they can't do any more damage. The first document was a complete closure of my primary checking account, the one Sarah had been draining through those small, careful withdrawals. Margaret processed the closure and immediately opened a new account at a different branch, one that neither Sarah nor Glenn would have any knowledge of. The remaining balance of $47,312 was transferred to the new account, safe from their reaching fingers. Next came the credit cards. Every card that Sarah might have had access to, and given that she'd lived in my house on and off for years, that was most of them, was canceled immediately. The customer service representatives were apologetic about the inconvenience, but I assured them it was necessary. Suspected fraud, I explained, which was absolutely true, but the bank was just the beginning. My next stop was the office of Patricia Holbrook, the attorney who'd handled my legal affairs since I'd started Morrison Construction 28 years ago. Patricia had been shocked by my phone call the night before, but she'd agreed to meet me first thing in the morning. "Gerald, what you're describing sounds like elder abuse," she said, her voice serious as she reviewed the evidence I'd printed from the ship's business center. "The unauthorized access to your accounts, the forged emails, the attempt to manipulate your insurance policy. This goes far beyond simple theft." "I don't want to press charges," I told her, and she looked up in surprise. "Gerald, they tried to kill you, and your own daughter was part of it." The words hit me like a physical blow, but I forced myself to stay focused. "Patricia, I've thought about this all night. Legal proceedings would take years, and in the meantime, they'd have access to information about my assets, my business operations, everything. I want them cut off completely and permanently." Patricia nodded slowly. "What do you want to do?" "I want to disappear from their lives so completely that they'll never find me again. And I want to make sure they can't profit from my death if they succeed in killing me later." The next 2 hours were spent restructuring my entire financial life. Patricia helped me establish a new will, one that left everything to a charitable foundation I'd been supporting quietly for years, the Morrison Foundation for Adult Literacy, named after my late wife who'd been a teacher. Sarah and Glenn weren't mentioned anywhere in the document. We also set up a trust that would handle my day-to-day expenses from a separate account, one that would be managed by Patricia's firm. The trust was designed to be completely anonymous. Even if Sarah or Glenn hired investigators, they wouldn't be able to trace it back to me. But the most important step was the sale of my house. Patricia contacted a real estate agent she'd worked with before, someone who specialized in quick private sales. "We can have the paperwork ready by tomorrow," she assured me. "The market's good right now, and your house is in excellent condition. You should be able to get close to your asking price." The asking price was $468,000, money that would disappear into accounts Sarah and Glenn would never find. My phone had been buzzing all morning with calls and texts from both of them. Sarah's messages were increasingly frantic. "Dad, where are you? We're worried. Are you? Glenn's been looking for you at the luggage area. Please call me back." Glenn's messages were shorter but more aggressive. "Gerald, we need to talk. This is ridiculous. Call me now." I ignored them all. My final stop of the day was Morrison Construction's headquarters, the business I'd built from nothing more than a pickup truck and a toolbox. My partner Marcus was waiting for me, along with our company attorney and our accountant. The meeting was brief but decisive. "Effective immediately, I'm selling my stake in Morrison Construction to you, Marcus," I announced, sliding the papers across the conference table. "The price is fair market value, $2.3 million. But I want the transaction completed within 48 hours. Marcus stared at the documents in shock. "Gerald, what's going on? Yesterday you were on vacation, and today you're selling the business you've spent 30 years building?" "Family complications," I said simply. "People I trusted have been stealing from me and planning worse. I need to make sure they can't get their hands on anything I've worked for." The accountant reviewed the numbers while the attorney examined the legal language. Everything was in order. I'd been planning this possibility for longer than anyone realized, ever since I'd started suspecting that something was wrong. The sale price would give Marcus full control of the company, and the money would go directly into an offshore account I'd established years ago for tax purposes. By 6 o'clock that evening, I was effectively invisible. My bank accounts were closed or transferred to institutions Sarah and Glenn had never heard of. My credit cards were canceled. My house was listed for sale with instructions to complete the transaction as quickly as possible. My business was sold. Even my cell phone was disconnected. I'd gotten a new number from a different carrier, one that only Patricia and Marcus knew. I drove to a modest apartment complex on the other side of town, one I'd rented that morning using cash and a simple month-to-month lease. The apartment was furnished, nothing fancy, but it was clean and quiet and completely separate from the life I'd been living for the past 65 years. As I sat in my new living room that evening, eating takeout Chinese food and watching the sunset through windows that Sarah and Glenn would never find, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: peace. My phone, the new one, rang once around 8 o'clock. It was Patricia. "Gerald, it's done. The house sold to a cash buyer for $450,000. The closing is scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. Marcus completed the business purchase, and the funds have been transferred to your designated accounts. As of right now, you have effectively erased yourself from their ability to find or hurt you. What about the foundation? All set up. The Morrison Foundation will receive the bulk of your estate upon your death with a small provision for basic living expenses maintained through the trust. Your daughter and son-in-law won't see a penny. After I hung up, I sat in the silence of my new life and thought about Sarah, my little girl, who used to build sandcastles with me at the beach, who'd cried when her goldfish died, who'd hugged me so tight after her mother's funeral that I thought she'd never let go. Somewhere along the way, that little girl had become someone I didn't recognize, someone capable of planning my death for money. The grief was overwhelming, but so was the relief. For the first time in months, I wasn't looking over my shoulder, wasn't wondering who I could trust, wasn't afraid that the people closest to me were planning my destruction. Tomorrow, Sarah and Glenn would start discovering the new reality I'd created for them. The credit cards would be declined, the bank accounts would be empty, the house would have a sold sign in the yard, and I would be gone, disappeared so completely that they'd never find me. I poured myself a glass of wine, cheap wine from the grocery store, not the expensive bottles Glenn used to bring to dinner, and raised it in a toast to the man I used to be, the trusting father, the generous provider, the man who believed that family meant something sacred. That man was gone now, drowned in the Atlantic Ocean, along with his illusions about the people he'd loved most. The man sitting in this modest apartment, invisible and untouchable, was someone else entirely. Someone who understood that sometimes the greatest act of love is walking away before the people who claim to love you can destroy you completely. And tomorrow, Sarah and Glenn would begin to learn just how thoroughly they'd lost the game they thought they were winning. The first call came at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning, exactly 11 days after I'd disappeared from their lives. I was making coffee in my small kitchen when the new phone rang, displaying a number I didn't recognize. For a moment, I considered not answering. I'd been enjoying the silence, the peace of a life without manipulation and threats. But curiosity won, and I pressed accept without saying a word. "Dad?" Sarah's voice was small, broken, nothing like the confident woman who'd helped plan my murder just 2 weeks earlier. "Dad, please, if this is you, please answer me." I said nothing, just listened to her breathe on the other end of the line. "I know you're there," she continued, her voice cracking with desperation. "I can hear you breathing. Dad, please, we need to talk. Something terrible has happened. All our accounts are frozen, the credit cards aren't working, and there's a sold sign on your house. I don't understand what's going on." Still, I remained silent. The woman on the other end of this call had watched her husband push me into the ocean. She'd helped plan my death for money. Whatever desperation she was feeling now was a fraction of what I'd experienced in those freezing waters, fighting for my life while my own family hoped I'd drown. "Dad, please," she sobbed now, the sound raw and genuine. "I know we made mistakes, but we're family. You can't just disappear like this. We're losing everything." Good, I thought. Let them lose everything. Let them feel what it's like to have the ground disappear beneath their feet. "Glenn's been fired from his job," Sarah continued, as if sharing more bad news would somehow make me sympathetic. "His boss said there were irregularities in his expense reports and they let him go without severance. And my landlord is threatening eviction because the rent check bounced. Dad, I don't know what to do." I ended the call without saying a word, but Sarah wasn't giving up easily. Over the next 3 days, she called 17 more times, each message more desperate than the last. She'd somehow tracked down my new number, probably through the phone company, using tears and lies about a family emergency. Each call revealed more of their crumbling world. Glenn had indeed been fired, but not just for expense report irregularities. Sarah let slip in one sobbing message that he'd been caught trying to forge documents related to a construction project, using my company letterhead and my forged signature. Marcus must have figured out the pattern and reported him. Their apartment was being foreclosed on. Sarah had been living beyond her means for months, counting on my death to solve all their financial problems. Without access to my accounts, and with Glenn unemployed, they couldn't make their rent, their car payments, or even their minimum credit card payments. "Dad, we went to your house yesterday," Sarah said in her 8th call. "There were strangers living there. They said they bought it 2 weeks ago, that you sold it to them through some kind of quick sale. How could you sell the house where Mom died, where I grew up? How could you erase us like this?" I almost answered that one. Almost. Because the house where her mother died was sacred to me too, but it was also the house where Sarah had gone through my private papers, where Glenn had planned my murder, where they'd counted my money like vultures circling a dying animal. Some places become poisoned by the memories they hold. The 9th call was different. Glenn's voice came through the speaker, harder and more threatening than Sarah's desperate pleas. "Gerald, I know you're listening to these messages. This has gone far enough. You can't just disappear and leave us with nothing. We have rights. Sarah is your daughter, your only child. You can't cut family off like this over a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding? He was calling attempted murder a misunderstanding. "Look, maybe I made some mistakes on that cruise," he continued, his voice taking on the manipulative tone I now recognized so clearly. "But I was stressed, overwhelmed. I never meant for things to go as far as they did. And Sarah had nothing to do with any of it. She's innocent in all this." Innocent. The word made me laugh out loud in my empty apartment. Sarah, who'd been draining my accounts for months. Sarah, who'd been in my office going through my files. Sarah, who'd stood on that deck and watched her husband push me into the ocean. Innocent. "We know you're alive, Gerald. We know you're out there somewhere, and we're going to find you." That call ended, but it was followed immediately by another one. Sarah again. But this time she wasn't crying. This time her voice held something cold and calculated that reminded me disturbingly of Glenn. "Dad, I've been thinking about everything that happened on that cruise, about your fall, about the way you've been acting since then, and I'm starting to wonder if maybe you're not as confused as we thought. Maybe you remember more than you let on." My blood ran cold. "If that's true, then we need to talk, because there are things you don't understand, situations that forced us to make difficult decisions. Glenn's in serious trouble with some people, Dad. Dangerous people who don't care about family or loyalty or anything except getting their money back." Now she was trying to make me feel sorry for them, trying to make their desperate financial situation my responsibility. "These people don't just take your house or your car when you can't pay, Dad. They take fingers, they take lives, and they don't care if Sarah gets hurt in the process. Is that what you want? Your daughter paying for Glenn's mistakes with her blood?" I hung up on that message before it finished, my hands shaking with rage. Now they were trying to manipulate me with threats of violence, trying to make me believe that Sarah was in danger from mysterious creditors. But I'd done my research over the past 11 days. I'd hired a private investigator to look into Glenn's background, to find out exactly what kind of debts he'd accumulated. The truth was both better and worse than Sarah's dramatic claims. Glenn did owe money, a lot of money, but not to dangerous criminals. He owed $17,463 to various credit card companies, $8,200 to a payday loan service, and another $12,000 to an online gambling site. All legal debts, all handled through normal collection procedures. No one was going to hurt Sarah, but their credit was ruined and they were facing bankruptcy. The calls continued for another week, becoming more frantic and more manipulative with each passing day. Sarah tried guilt, reminding me of childhood memories and family holidays. Glenn tried intimidation, suggesting that abandoning family was immoral and possibly illegal. Together, they tried bargaining, promising to pay back everything they'd stolen if I'd just helped them get back on their feet. But it was the 18th call that broke my heart completely. "Dad, it's me." Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm calling from the hospital. Glenn tried to hurt himself last night. He took a bunch of pills, said he couldn't live with what we'd done, said he couldn't face the consequences anymore. I felt my chest tighten despite everything they'd put me through." "He's okay," she continued quickly. "They pumped his stomach and he's stable now. But Dad, he's not the same man I married. The stress, the guilt, the financial pressure, it's destroying him. And it's destroying me too." There was a long pause, and when she spoke again, her voice was different, smaller, more like the little girl I remembered. "I know what we did was wrong. I know we hurt you in ways that probably can't be forgiven, but Dad, I'm scared. I'm alone, and I don't know how to fix this. I don't even know how we got to this point. When did we become the kind of people who would hurt someone we love? When did we become so desperate that murder seemed like a solution?" For the first time since the cruise, I heard genuine remorse in her voice. Not manipulation, not bargaining, but real recognition of what they'd done. "I keep thinking about that night on the ship, about watching you disappear over that railing, and I can't understand how I stood there and let it happen. What kind of daughter does that? What kind of person have I become?" The call ended there, and for the first time in weeks I found myself crying, not for what I'd lost, but for what Sarah had lost. Somewhere along the way, my little girl had traded her soul for money, and now she was finally beginning to understand the price she'd paid. But understanding the cost of her choices didn't erase the consequences. It didn't bring back the trust she'd shattered or undo the betrayal that had nearly cost me my life, and it certainly didn't mean I was going to rescue them from the mess they'd created. The next morning, I did something I'd been avoiding for 3 weeks. I drove to the cemetery where my wife Margaret was buried, to the grave I visited every year on her birthday and the anniversary of her death. I knelt beside her headstone and told her everything about Sarah's betrayal, about Glenn's attempt on my life, about the way I disappeared from their lives like smoke in the wind. I hope I did the right thing, Maggie, I whispered to the cold stone. I hope our little girl can find her way back to the person she used to be, but I can't be the one to save her. Some lessons can only be learned the hard way. As I drove away from the cemetery, my phone rang one more time. Sarah's number appeared on the screen, but this time I didn't hesitate. I answered. Hello, Sarah. The sharp intake of breath on the other end told me she hadn't expected me to finally respond. Dad, she whispered, as if saying my name too loudly might make me disappear again. Dad, please don't hang up. I know I don't deserve it, but please just listen to me for 1 minute. I waited. I'm sorry, she said, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I believed her. I'm sorry for everything. For the money, for the lies, for standing there and watching Glenn hurt you. I'm sorry for becoming someone I don't recognize, someone who could plan such horrible things. She paused and I could hear her crying softly. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to help us. But I needed you to know that I remember who you really are, Dad. You're the man who worked 3 jobs to send me to college, who held me when Mom died, who taught me that family was supposed to be about love, not money. The line went quiet for a moment, and then she said the words that would haunt me for years to come. I know I destroyed our family, Dad, but please don't let Glenn's mistakes destroy you too. You deserve to be happy, to find peace, even if that peace doesn't include us. The call ended, and I sat in my car outside the cemetery, finally understanding that this was goodbye, not just to Sarah and Glenn, but to the man I used to be. The father who would have done anything to protect his daughter even from herself. That chapter of my life was over, and tomorrow I would begin to discover what the next chapter might hold. 2 years have passed since that final phone call from Sarah. 2 years since I heard my daughter's voice breaking with genuine remorse, since she released me from the obligation to save her from the consequences of her own choices. 2 years of silence, of peace, of learning who Gerald Morrison really is when he's not defined by other people's needs and betrayals. The morning after that last conversation, I made a decision that surprised even me. I packed what little I owned in my small apartment into 2 suitcases and drove to the coast. Not to the busy beaches where tourists crowd together, but to a quiet stretch of North Carolina shoreline where retired fishermen sell their catch from weathered docks, and the pace of life moves with the tides instead of the stock market. I rented a cottage 6 blocks from the water, a simple 2-bedroom place with blue shutters and a front porch that faces the sunrise. The rent is $450 a month, paid from the trust Patricia manages for me. It's less than I used to spend on dinner for 3 people, but it's enough. More than enough. The cottage came furnished with the kind of solid, practical furniture that lasts decades. A kitchen table scarred by years of use, bookshelves built by someone who understood that books need homes, a bed frame that doesn't creak when the wind blows. Everything I need, and nothing I don't. Most mornings, I walk down to Garrett's Bait and Tackle, where old men gather to drink coffee and complain about the weather, the government, and the way fish don't bite like they used to. Nobody asks me what I did before I came here, what brought me to this quiet corner of the world. In a place where half the population is running from something, privacy is respected above almost everything else. I told them my name was Gerald, no reason to lie about that, and that I used to build things for a living. That's true enough. What I didn't tell them is that I built a multi-million-dollar construction company from nothing, or that I gave it all away to escape a family that tried to kill me. Some truths are too heavy for casual conversation. 3 months after I arrived, Garrett offered me a part-time job helping customers and cleaning the shop. Nothing fancy, he said. Just someone to mind the register when I'm out on the water. The pay is $12 an hour, barely enough to buy groceries. But it gives me something to do with my hands and a reason to interact with people who don't want anything from me except honest work. The customers are mostly locals, commercial fishermen buying supplies, weekend warriors stocking up for their boat trips, and the occasional tourist who's wandered off the main highway. They pay in cash, say thank you, and leave. No one tries to manipulate me or steal from me or push me into the ocean. It's remarkably peaceful. In the evenings, I sit on my front porch and read. Not business journals or financial reports, but novels I never had time for when I was building my empire. I've discovered that I enjoy mysteries, stories about people uncovering hidden truths and finding justice in unexpected places. The irony isn't lost on me. Sometimes, when the weather's good, I walk down to the beach and watch the sunset paint the sky in colors that no artist could ever capture properly. The Atlantic Ocean stretches to the horizon, the same ocean that nearly killed me 2 years ago. But here, it's different. Here it's beautiful instead of terrifying, endless instead of suffocating. I've learned to fish, something I never had time for in my old life. Garrett taught me to read the water, to understand which lures work in which conditions, to be patient enough to wait for the fish to come to me instead of trying to force the process. There are parallels to life that I'm still discovering. The cottage has a small garden where the previous tenant grew tomatoes and herbs. I've expanded it, adding peppers and squash and a row of sunflowers that grow taller than the fence. Working in the dirt, coaxing life from the soil, has become a kind of meditation. My hands, which once signed contracts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, are now permanently stained with earth, and I've never been happier with what they're creating. Patricia calls once a month to check on me and handle the administrative details of my new existence. She's the only person from my old life who knows where I am, and I trust her to keep that secret. During our last conversation, she told me something that didn't surprise me but still made me sad. Gerald, I thought you should know. Sarah filed for bankruptcy 6 months ago, Glenn too. They lost everything, the apartment, the cars, even Sarah's engagement ring. From what I understand, they're living in a studio apartment in a questionable part of town, and Sarah's working 2 jobs to make ends meet. And Glenn, I asked, still unemployed? Apparently, word has gotten around about his forged documents and attempted fraud. No construction company in the area will hire him. I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow at this news. Satisfaction because justice had been served. Sorrow because my daughter was paying the price for trusting the wrong man. There's something else, Patricia continued. Sarah tried to contact me last month. She wanted to know if there was any way to reach you, not for money or help, but to tell you something. I told her no, but she asked me to pass along a message if I ever spoke to you. What did she say? Patricia was quiet for a moment. She said to tell you that she understands now why you had to disappear. She said she's glad you're safe wherever you are, and that she hopes you've found peace. That message stayed with me for days. Sarah had finally learned the difference between wanting forgiveness and deserving it, between understanding consequences and trying to escape them. Maybe, somewhere in the ruins of her life, she was finding her way back to the person she used to be. But that was her journey to make, not mine to guide. Last week, something happened that reminded me how far I've traveled from my old life. I was restocking inventory at the shop when a man in an expensive suit walked in, clearly lost and irritated about it. He looked around with obvious distaste at the weathered walls and the smell of fish bait. "Excuse me," he said in the tone rich people use when they're talking to servants. "I'm looking for Gerald Morrison. I understand he might be in this area." My blood went cold, but I kept my expression neutral. "Don't know anyone by that name," I said, continuing to arrange lures on their display rack. "He's a businessman from Florida, built a construction company, had significant assets. His family is looking for him." I met his eyes steadily. "Like I said, don't know anyone like that around here. You might try the Chamber of Commerce up in town." The man looked frustrated but handed me his business card anyway. "If you happen to hear anything, there's a reward for information leading to his location." After he left, I looked at the card. He was a private investigator hired by a law firm I'd never heard of. On the back, someone had written, "Family seeks reconciliation," in neat handwriting. I tore up the card and threw it in the trash. Family seeks reconciliation. Even after everything they'd done, even after their lives had fallen apart, Sarah and Glenn were still trying to find me, still hoping to manipulate me into rescuing them from their self-created hell. But the old Gerald, the man who would have felt guilty for causing their suffering, was gone. The man standing in that bait shop, surrounded by the honest smell of the sea and the tools of simple work, felt only relief that they hadn't found me. That evening, I called Patricia and told her about the investigator. "Change everything," I told her. "New trust documents, new account numbers, new everything. And if anyone else comes looking for information about Gerald Morrison, tell them he died in a boating accident 2 years ago." "Gerald, are you sure that's a pretty permanent step?" I looked out my kitchen window at the garden I'd planted, at the sunset painting the sky in impossible colors, at the simple life I'd built from the ashes of betrayal. "Patricia, Gerald Morrison did die 2 years ago. He drowned in the Atlantic Ocean when his family pushed him overboard. The man you're talking to now is someone else entirely, someone who finally understands that sometimes the greatest act of love is walking away before the people who claim to love you can destroy you completely." 2 weeks later, Patricia sent me a death certificate. According to the official record, Gerald Morrison died in a boating accident off the coast of North Carolina. His body never recovered. The Morrison Foundation received his entire estate, just as planned, and would continue supporting adult literacy programs in perpetuity. Gerald Morrison was officially dead, and I had never felt more alive. This morning I woke up in my cottage by the sea. made coffee with water I don't have to worry about being poisoned, and walked to a job where my coworkers don't want to kill me for money. Tonight I'll tend my garden, read another chapter of the mystery novel I started yesterday, and fall asleep without wondering if tomorrow will bring another attempt on my life. The 3 words I whispered to Glenn in that ship's medical bay, "I know everything," had been a warning shot across the bow of his sinking ship. But the real victory wasn't in those words. The real victory was in learning that I didn't need to defeat them to win. I just needed to disappear completely, to become invisible to their desperate grasping, to find peace in a life they could never touch. Some people might call what I did cruel, leaving my daughter to face the consequences of her choices without a safety net, letting Glenn's desperation consume him without offering help. But I've learned that sometimes the cruelest thing you can do to someone is to keep rescuing them from their own mistakes. Sarah and Glenn made their choices on that cruise ship when they decided my life was worth less than my money. Now they're living with those choices, learning that actions have consequences, discovering who they really are when the people they've been using are no longer available to be used. As for me, I'm learning who I am when I'm not defined by other people's needs, demands, and betrayals. I'm discovering that happiness doesn't require wealth or status or even family. Sometimes it just requires the courage to walk away from everything that's hurting you and start over with nothing but your integrity intact. The sun is setting over the Atlantic now, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that make the water look like liquid fire. It's the same ocean that nearly killed me. But from this angle, at this distance, it's beautiful instead of terrifying. That seems like a metaphor for something, but I'm too content to figure out exactly what. Tomorrow I'll wake up in my cottage by the sea, tend my garden, go to work at the bait shop, and live another day of the quiet, honest life I've built from the wreckage of betrayal. And Sarah and Glenn will wake up in whatever small apartment they can afford, face another day of consequences they created for themselves, and continue learning the hardest lesson of all, that some mistakes can't be undone, some trust can't be rebuilt, and some people will disappear from your life so completely that you'll spend the rest of your days wondering if they ever really existed at all. I exist. I'm just not theirs to find anymore. And that, I've discovered, is the most perfect revenge of all, becoming so happy without them that their very existence becomes irrelevant to my peace.